What do you know about the faith you profess? What if the Bible, the Quran, and the oldest scrolls had omitted the most important chapter? Why were the gods of Africa erased from history? For millennia, they have tried to convince us that the genesis of wisdom, resurrection, and divine order was born elsewhere. But beneath the Nubian sun and in the depths of the Nile lies the greatest secret on the planet, the forbidden story of the African gods who shaped 3 religions. This is not a history lesson. It is a spiritual revelation. You are about to discover how the African sacred triad Osiris, Isis, and Horus became the source of all divine archetypes, a cosmic theft that rewrote the destiny of humanity. It is the truth about the chronology of faith that has been hidden forever. Prepare to see your vision of the past and present change forever. And if this ancestral journey resonates with your spirit, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments, from which part of the world are you hearing the awakening of Africa? The silence is broken. The scroll of time holds a dangerous secret. The silence imposed on Africa was no accident. For ages, they told the story of humanity as if Eden were elsewhere, forging a curtain of sand over the oldest temples on the planet and silencing the names of the original gods who inhabited them. This silence is not merely historical, it is an open spiritual wound, where ancestral knowledge has been replaced by fear. This break in the record, however, is the true mystery. Why so much effort to erase an origin? Beneath the dunes, archaeology whispers uncomfortable truths, revealing ruins of cities and kingdoms from which the very idea of organized divinity seems to have radiated. The spiritual conflict lies in the dispute over the primacy of faith, where African antiquity has become the greatest threat to the dominant narrative. The symbolic journey of discovery begins the moment the viewer allows themselves to question. Imagine touching a dark basalt stone in Sudan, feeling the weight of 7,000 years, and realizing that the deities engraved there are the fathers and mothers of the figures we venerate today. It is a journey back to the source, which requires courage and a mind free from dogma. The spiritual unfolding of this revelation is the awakening of a lineage of knowledge. It is not about converting or judging, but about recognizing the interconnectedness. The breath of life that animated the first god in the Nile is the same one we still seek on our altars. It is as if ancestral memory vibrates, waiting only to be heard to complete the cycle of wisdom. Thus, the silence was not broken by shouts, but by a persistent whisper that travels through the centuries, carried by the wind that sweeps across the Great Plains. Before faith became dogma and the divine became scarce, Africa already knew immortality, resurrection, and cosmic order. But who are, in fact, these divine ancestors whose names have been changed? To understand this forgotten history, one must fix one's gaze on the cradle of creation, the golden vastness of the Nile Valley, but specifically on the region of Kush and ancient Nubia. This place was not merely a geographical map. It was a spiritual portal where rivers and desert met to generate civilization and, with it, the first conception of divine order. The very earth breathed the presence of the gods. The mystery is this: while classical Egypt is studied incessantly, the history of its masters, the Kushites and Nubians, is conveniently ignored or minimized. The revelation lies in the foundations. Many of the rituals and symbols that Egypt celebrated came from kingdoms to the south, where black kings ruled and were considered direct manifestations of solar and telluric deities. The journey takes us to Meroe, the city of 100 dark pyramids, with steeper and more ancient angles than the famous ones at Giza. It is a symbolic pilgrimage that forces us to recalibrate the map of faith, understanding that the complexity of mythology was born on African soil, long before any invasion or colonization. The architects of the divine were there, under the strong sun. The spiritual unfolding of this landscape is the concept that divinity is immanent, born from African nature itself. The connection with the Nile, with its cycle of floods and droughts, gave rise to myths of death and resurrection, of fertility and return. Life was seen as an eternal return, an echo of the cosmic dance that the ancestors observed in the heavens. In this creation scenario, the first great divine family emerges, the original Triad, which not only ruled the heavens and the earth, but established the moral and mystical standard for all humanity. They were the synthesis of death, magic, and rebirth. But who are these three pillars whose names have been so cruelly rewritten? Every great faith rests on pillars, and before the West adopted its own, Africa had already established the sacred formula, the original Triad. These are not separate figures, but aspects of a cosmic drama that teaches about life, death, and eternal renewal. It is the ancestral myth that gives weight and purpose to all human suffering and the promise of redemption. The protagonist of this mystery is Osiris, the civilizing king who suffers betrayal, is dismembered, and ultimately resurrects, becoming the lord of the underworld. The conflict is the struggle between order and chaos, between life and death. His legend is not merely a story of mourning, it is the first and most powerful affirmation that death is not the end, but a necessary transition. The symbolic journey of Osiris, dismembered and then reunited, is a metaphor for the African people themselves throughout the centuries, fragmented yet indestructible in essence. He is the archetype of sacrifice that generates life, and his promise of return was a comfort to millions, long before other prophets announced it. The spiritual unfolding of this triad is completed with its companion, Isis, the Lady of Magic. In her resides the key to all revelation. Her search for Osiris's body and the conception of her son, Horus, transforms her into the mother goddess, the feminine force that not only gives birth but also resurrects. She is the protector, the healer, the power that manipulates the threads of destiny. Horus, in turn, is the avenging sun, the rising sun who defeats darkness and restores order. The cycle is complete. The father who dies, the mother who gives birth, and the son who redeems. This sacred structure, with its symbolism of death, rebirth, and triumph, spread like a mystical seed to the north and east, shaping future narratives. But how was this chronology subverted? The official history we learn is, in many respects, a trick of time, a perspective that reversed the order of birth of great ideas. The chronological challenge is simple. The myth of resurrection, of the virgin who conceives, and of judgment after death existed in the Nile Valley thousands of years before it was recorded in the texts we now call sacred in other parts of the world. The mystery lies not in what was written, but in what was dated and popularized. While the tales of Osiris circulated in Africa in 400 BC, the narratives that replaced them would emerge centuries or millennia later. The revelation is that the spiritual matrix of human civilization points southward, to the lands of the Black Pharaohs, and not to the Fertile Crescent, as they insist we believe. This symbolic journey leads us to confront the idea that antiquity confers spiritual authority. When observing the panels of Nubian and Egyptian temples, one notices the theological complexity of the original triad, with concepts of paradise, hell, and sin that reflect, in rich detail, later doctrines. It is as if we were reading the draft of all the great faiths. The spiritual implication of this reversal of dates is that Africa holds the mystical DNA of humanity. The concept of Ma'at, the cosmic order, justice, and truth that govern the universe, was the moral basis for the laws of Moses and the ethical principles of many cultures. Wisdom is not an import, but an export from this ancestral continent. Therefore, the challenge of chronology is not merely academic. It is the awakening of the spiritual self-esteem of a continent. What was primary has been relegated to secondary, but the essence has never been lost. This essence, however, would face an overwhelming force that would attempt to extinguish it from memory: exile. The exile of the African gods was not physical, but an imposed silence, a cruel maneuver to eradicate the memory that Africa was the source of faith and not a destination for salvation. It was a slow and painful process, where conquerors and new doctrines simply renamed the sacred, dressing the ancient gods in saintly robes or, worse, relegating them to the category of demons. The great mystery is how such profound and structured knowledge could be erased from global consciousness so efficiently. The spiritual conflict arose when emperors and religious leaders realized that, as long as the population saw in Isis the face of the Divine Mother and in Osiris the rebirth, they would never fully embrace the new narratives. The erasure was a political and theological necessity. The symbolic journey of the gods became one of fleeing into the shadows. Isis, for example, was adapted into Roman cults, then her temples were closed, but her essence, the woman with her child in her lap, persisted, being transfigured. It is as if the energy of the mother goddess was so powerful that it was impossible to eliminate it, forcing the new creeds to absorb it. The spiritual unfolding of this persecution lies in syncretism. The people, in their ancestral wisdom, never abandoned their gods. They merely gave them new names to survive. The ritual of resurrection remained, the concept of moral judgment was maintained, but now it was spoken in another language, with other trappings, to deceive the vigilance of the new dogmas. So, exile was not the death of the African divine, but its submersion. The sacred learned to be secret, to live in songs, drums, and whispered legends. And it is in these shadows that the essence of Africa has been preserved, waiting for the right moment to emerge again and challenge the lies of official history. All ancestral knowledge is guarded by a powerful symbol, and in Africa, one of the most enigmatic is the sacred serpent, the Ouroboros, which bites its own tail, or the uraeus, which adorns the crowns of the pharaohs. This is not a sign of evil, as it has been distorted since then, but the supreme code of the universe, the infinite cycle of creation and destruction, wisdom that renews itself. The mystery of the serpent lies in its power of transformation. By shedding its skin, it represents resurrection, rebirth, and immortality, a fundamental lesson from African mythology that would spread throughout the Mediterranean. The spiritual conflict here is the demonization of this symbol, the act of transforming what was sacred into something sinful, cutting off the people from the source of their own wisdom. The symbolic journey of the serpent is that of human destiny itself. It represents vital energy, kundalini in other cultures, the force that rises from the ground, connecting the earth, the ancestors, to the sky, the gods. It is a representation of totality and eternity, a mystical map of the path to hidden knowledge. The spiritual unfolding lies in recognizing that many ancient African cults used the serpent as a channel for prophecies and healings, as a bridge between the material and spiritual worlds. Understanding the serpent is deciphering the mystical alphabet of Africa, the visual language that reveals the interconnectedness of all things. This code, engraved on stones and fabrics, is a secret that has survived the ravages of time. It reminds us that truth is cyclical, never linear, and that the end is always a new beginning. But how exactly did this coded wisdom influence the narratives of the great prophets? The mystic seed of Africa was planted in other lands through journeys and exiles, ensuring that ancestral knowledge was not contained by borders. The Bible and other sacred texts record, albeit subtly, how crucial figures of monotheism spent long years in the land of the Nile, absorbing the complex African theology that already existed there. The mystery is not whether these prophets were in Africa, but what they actually learned there. The conflict lies in the purposeful omission of years of apprenticeship in Egyptian and Nubian temples, where the structure of law, the ethics of Ma'at, and the idea of a single supreme god behind the pantheon were taught to initiates, such as Moses. The symbolic journey of these leaders to Africa was an initiation. They entered seeking refuge or knowledge and left with a revolutionary theological framework that would become the basis of their own revelations. The most profound revelation was that the wisdom was already there. It simply needed to be adapted and translated for a new people. The spiritual implication of this connection is that the great monotheistic faiths owe a debt of origin to Africa. The story of Noah and the flood, for example, or the idea of resurrection, echo African tales in an almost identical way, proving that the source of mystical inspiration first sprang from the south. Thus, Africa acted as the great university of the spirit for the ancient world, sowing ideas that, when transplanted, generated new religions. But where else did these symbols and beliefs spread, and what did they leave behind? Many of Africa's deepest secrets lie beneath a layer of water and sand today, such as the legendary submerged temple that holds irrefutable truths about faith. Consider ancient sanctuaries in the Nile Valley, flooded by the construction of dams or by the river itself, which, paradoxically, was the source of all life and civilization. What modernity has hidden beneath its waters is the testament to a faith that existed before any dogma. The mystery lies in the feeling that, by touching the muddy waters of the Nile, we are touching a drowned divinity. The spiritual conflict manifests itself in the sacrifice of history in the name of progress, where human haste buries centuries of ancestral wisdom, transforming temples into aquatic silence. The revelation is the fact that nature, the Nile, has become the silent guardian of the banished gods. The symbolic journey becomes a dive in search of what was lost, seeking in the depths the truth about the cult of life and death that inspired the original Triad. It is necessary to close one's eyes and listen to the murmur of those stones, imagining the rituals that celebrated the annual resurrection, imitating the cycle of floods and ebbs of the sacred river. The spiritual unfolding of this submerged temple is the understanding that African faith is not afraid of water, mystery, or darkness. The sacred resides in hidden places, in the abysses, waiting for humanity to be mature enough to reclaim it. Divinity has not fled. It has retreated to its most fluid and primordial essence. The temple was not destroyed. It was preserved in its own aquatic exile, a mystical time capsule. It reminds us that the memory of Africa is like the Nile. It floods, transforms, and never stops flowing, always carrying with it the seeds of creation. And it is this power of transformation that has led the divine names to adapt and persist in other cultures. The most sublime wisdom bequeathed by Africa, and the ethical pillar of its entire cosmology, is the concept of Ma'at, the personification of order, justice, truth, and balance. She was not merely a goddess, but the very law of the universe, the moral standard that governed kings, peasants, and gods. Her presence was felt in the final judgment of the soul, where the heart of the deceased was weighed against the lightness of their feather. The mystery lies not in what Ma'at represented, but in how this idea of immaculate justice was transplanted and simplified into later moral codes, often losing the subtlety of cosmic balance in favor of punitive rules. The spiritual conflict resides in the fact that ancient African ethics were based on personal responsibility to the universe and the community, and not merely on the fear of divine punishment. The symbolic journey of the concept of Ma'at is that of civilization itself, the search for a state of perfect harmony. It taught that truth is light, and that the weight of bad faith is what prevents the soul from transcending. This was the wisdom that circulated in the temples and profoundly influenced the laws and prophets who visited the region. The spiritual unfolding of this cosmic balance lies in the promise that order will always prevail over chaos, even if injustice reigns on earth for a time. Ma'at's lesson is a call to non-negotiable integrity, a teaching that resonates in all the great moral laws of the planet, demonstrating the ethical depth of ancestral Africa. Thus, the law was not first written on tablets of stone, but was intrinsically linked to the human heart and the order of the cosmos, with the pen of Ma'at as a silent witness. This wisdom was protected and transmitted through a specific lineage of power. But who were the guardians of this knowledge? History, as it has been told to us, has erased the kings, queens, and societies that truly possessed and protected ancestral knowledge before it was diluted. We speak here of the forgotten lineage, the sons of Cush, the black sovereigns who, for centuries, ruled not only Nubia but extended their power and sacred religion to Egypt, being, for a time, the true source of pharaonic authority. The great mystery is how this powerful lineage of black pharaohs, who built magnificent temples and preserved the purity of the original rituals, was systematically erased from history books, almost as if they had never existed. The spiritual conflict is the denial of Africa's capacity for self-governance and its religious complexity at a time when the rest of the world was still in its infancy. The symbolic journey takes us to the steep pyramids of Meroe, where warrior queens, the Kandakes, lie buried, having defied empires and protected the legacy of their divine ancestors. It is a journey of reclaiming dignity and power, showing that spiritual authority and political strength walked hand in hand in the heart of Africa. The spiritual unfolding of this lineage lies in the notion that the king was not merely a ruler, but the living manifestation of the god Horus, the link between heaven and earth. They were the guardians of Ma'at and the secrets of Osiris, ensuring that the cycle of life and faith was maintained in perfect order, a pattern of governance that inspires even today. Therefore, the legacy of these kings and queens lies not only in their stone ruins, but in the blood and memory that refuses to die, awaiting the right moment to reaffirm their spiritual sovereignty. But how exactly was this wisdom practiced and transmitted? In secret, through rituals. African sacred practices, when forced into exile, found refuge in secret cults and nocturnal rituals, far from the eyes and repression of the conquerors. Think of the ceremonies that took place under the cover of darkness, where only the sound of drums, the smell of burning herbs, and the flickering flame of candles broke the silence. It was there that true faith was practiced and transmitted. The mystery of these rituals lies in their spiritual efficacy. The drum is not merely music, it is the voice of the gods, the pulse of the universe that induces trance, the vibratory bridge that connects the initiate to the ancestor. The spiritual conflict arose because, for the new religions, everything done in darkness and involving the body and rhythm was labeled as witchcraft, attempting to devalue the channel of direct communication with the divine. The symbolic journey of the initiate, often taken away from the community and led to the forest or a secret camp, was a death and rebirth, imitating the drama of Osiris. Under the gaze of the stars, the person learned to decipher the symbols, to respect the orishas, to feel Ma'at in their own body, ensuring the fidelity of the knowledge. The spiritual unfolding of these nocturnal encounters is the intense sensory connection with the divine. The candles, with their specific colors, did not merely illuminate the altar, they ignited the soul. The drum did not simply play, it spoke and commanded, calling the spirit to manifest itself and guide the people. Therefore, what was forbidden flourished in secret, keeping the flame of knowledge burning even in the longest nights. The rituals, with their ancestral strength, survived the test of time, but the gods, with their names changed, had already traveled much further. African wisdom was not confined to the banks of the Nile. It traveled, often encoded in symbols and geometries, finding an echo in sacred architectures around the planet. We speak of the revelation of the triangle, the omnipresent shape that, in Egypt and Nubia, represented the primordial mountain from which life arose, and the soul's journey from the ground to the summit. The mystery lies not in the existence of pyramids on other continents, but in the striking uniformity of the sacred geometry that points to a shared knowledge. The spiritual conflict manifests itself in the denial that the mathematical and astronomical complexity behind these constructions, which linked heaven and earth, could have African roots. The symbolic journey leads us to connect the pyramids of Giza and Meroe to the temples in Mesopotamia and, incredibly, to the pre-Columbian structures in the Americas. It is a journey that suggests a mother civilization, a primordial knowledge about energy and creation that Africa preserved most clearly before the message fragmented. The spiritual unfolding of this geometry is that the triangle, the pyramid, is a map of ascension, a portal that allows the initiate to transcend the material world and reach the divine. The point at the apex represents unity, the first manifestation of the one God, whom Africans revered long before any doctrine. Therefore, the sacred structure of Africa left an indelible mark on the mystical architecture of the world. But if the divine had a universal face, who was the feminine figure that embodied the power of creation and magic? At the heart of the original Triad, and of all African magic, resides the feminine power embodied by the mother goddess, whom many know as Isis. She is the very essence of magic, healing, and sovereignty, the figure who alone reconstructs the sacred and ensures the continuity of life. Her dominion is not only over fertility, but over hidden knowledge and the key to eternal life. The mystery of Isis lies in her ability to be omnipresent, appearing and reappearing in various cultures with different names, but with the same attributes: the virgin who conceives, the lady of tears, the keeper of mystery. The spiritual conflict was the attempt to empty this feminine figure of her active power, transforming the mother goddess, mistress of magic, into a passive and submissive figure in later narratives. The symbolic journey of Isis shows us the indomitable power of love and perseverance. Her search for the dismembered body of Osiris and the reunion of the fragments is the ultimate ritual of resurrection, a lesson that feminine strength is essential to reverse chaos and bring order, Ma'at, back to the world. She is the protector of the royal lineage and ancestral knowledge. The spiritual unfolding of this deity is that she is the source of all magic and practical wisdom. Isis teaches that divine power lies in the ability to transform suffering into creation, death into life. Her gaze, her lap, and her veil are the origin of all maternal invocations of protection and grace. This powerful and universal goddess did not surrender to exile. She merely camouflaged herself, ensuring that the cycle of life continued to be honored through the female figure. Her strength is recorded not only in temples, but in documents that history attempted to burn. Not all wisdom was engraved in stone or transmitted orally. Some of it lies in ancient scrolls, the cursed texts, documents that were banned, censored, or destroyed by religious and political authorities throughout the centuries. Consider the fragments of papyrus in now-dead languages, written by African priests who dared to record the true origin of myths and rituals. The mystery of these texts lies in their capacity to rewrite the history of faith. If they were revealed and accepted, they would prove beyond a shadow of a doubt African primacy in the theology of resurrection and cosmic order. The spiritual conflict is the hunt for and destruction of these manuscripts, a deliberate effort to ensure that the official, already edited version remains the only truth. The symbolic journey of these texts is one of survival. Some were hidden in jars in the desert, others were rewritten in codes or absorbed into secret libraries, disguised among less threatening volumes. They are the silent testimony that faith has been distorted and that Africa has always known more about the heavens than it allowed itself to admit. The spiritual unfolding of this quest is that truth cannot be incinerated. The teachings of these scrolls continue to manifest in the art, poetry, and rituals of the diaspora, proving that knowledge, when sacred, transcends the materiality of paper. What was banished from the official library lives on in the hearts of the initiated. Therefore, the history of faith has immense gaps, filled by forced silences and forbidden documents. But the essence of this ancestral knowledge found an escape route that repression could never contain: the ship of the diaspora. The most fundamental and irremovable knowledge that Africa has preserved, and that the diaspora has carried, is contained in the sacred language, the very structure of the word. Think of the original writings, such as the MWNTR, the Word of God, of the Egyptians, or the NTU concept of the Bantu peoples, where the word, the force of life, is the essence of all that exists, and to speak is to create. The mystery lies not only in the complexity of these languages, but in the mystical power inherent in their phonetics. Each sound was a vibration that could invoke a force of nature, an orisha, or reconnect with an ancestor. The spiritual conflict was the prohibition of these languages, the attempt to impose languages of oppression so that, by not being able to pronounce the original names, the people would lose direct access to their spiritual power. The symbolic journey of the word is one of survival in murmuring. African syntax and rhythm survived in proverbs, work songs, and the coded beats of drums. What seemed to be mere folklore or music was, in fact, a complex code of cosmology, history, and magic. The word became the last sanctuary, the last relic that could not be confiscated or burned. The spiritual implication of this realization is that, even if the temples were destroyed and the gods renamed, the key to reactivating power always lay in the mouths of the people. The ancestral language is the engine of resurrection, the map that leads back to Ma'at. Thus, knowledge is not dead, but merely dormant in voices and songs. It awaits the moment when humanity, weary of false narratives, finally decides to listen to the uninterrupted echo of the original word of Africa. The story that has been swept under the rug of official history is the one about blood and resurrection, the eternal drama of the god who dies to be reborn and guarantee life for all. The myth of Osiris, with his sacrifice, his dismemberment, and his triumphant return, is not just a myth. It is the spiritual matrix that shaped the belief in life after death and the promise of redemption. The mystery lies in the remarkable similarity between the drama of Osiris and the central narrative of Christianity, a connection that official theology strives to ignore or discredit. The spiritual conflict manifests itself in the attempt to deny that the most powerful concept of faith, the miracle of resurrection, has deep and verifiable roots in African cosmology, thousands of years before other messianic figures. The symbolic journey is that of the grain of corn that must die in the earth to generate new life, a cycle that was celebrated annually during the Nile floods, the very vein of Osiris. It is the lesson that suffering and death are not the end point, but rather the gateway to an even greater transcendence, the guarantee that the spirit returns and order is restored. The spiritual unfolding of this powerful connection is proof that Africa has provided humanity with essential comfort, the hope of eternity. No matter what name one gives to the returning God, the message is universal. Sacrifice has a purpose, and the cycle of life is unbreakable. Blood and retribution become the immortal signature of the African pantheon, the non-negotiable truth that flowed beyond borders and withstood the test of time. This is the basis of what would become the vision of a divine future. Even with history rewritten and names changed, the truth does not remain silent. It merely manifests itself in new ways. We speak of the prophecy of return, the ancestral belief that the knowledge that was stolen and banished from Africa does not lie dead, but is merely dormant, awaiting the right moment, the kairos, to awaken the consciousness of a people. The mystery is not about a future event, but about the awakening of memory in the present. The spiritual conflict manifests itself in the struggle against historical amnesia and the underestimation of one's own identity, where ancestral truth becomes the catalyst for redemption. The prophecy teaches that, by recognizing their true gods and their origin, the children of Africa and the diaspora will recover their spiritual sovereignty. The symbolic journey is that of the diaspora returning to the motherland, no longer in search of exile, but of confirmation. It is the search for the original names, for the lost rituals, and for the ethics of Ma'at, a movement that is happening now, in the arts, in politics, and in faith. The spiritual unfolding of this prophecy is that the return is not physical, but mental. The ancestral African truth, with its vision of interconnectedness and cosmic justice, is what the modern, fragmented, and crisis-ridden world most needs to find balance. It is the remedy for chaos. Therefore, the prophecy is being fulfilled. What was banished is emerging, stronger and more necessary than ever, forcing the world to confront the history it tried to erase. What silence and erasure attempted to impose was a colossal weight on the conscience of a people, the weight of silence, the feeling that their own history was incomplete and that there was shame or emptiness in the origin of their faith. It is the emotional burden of having history denied and legacy transformed into folklore, a strategy to maintain spiritual control. The mystery lies not in what has been hidden, but in the persistent feeling that something grand and sacred awaits discovery. The spiritual conflict manifests in the internal struggle against indoctrination, where the soul feels the resonance of ancestral truth, even if the mind remains trapped in imposed narratives. It is the battle for spiritual self-determination. The symbolic journey is one of relieving this burden. Each discovery, each original name recovered, each papyrus deciphered is a fragment of the past that relieves the soul of the burden of denial. It is the journey back to the source, where truth is as natural as breathing. The spiritual unfolding of this liberation is the rediscovery of divine self-esteem. Africa is not the periphery of the history of faith, it is its center. This revelation allows the African people and the diaspora to reconnect with a lineage of power, wisdom, and royalty that has never been broken. Therefore, the silence is becoming light. The weight of stolen history is being replaced by the authority of ancestral truth. The end result of this cosmic theft was not merely the loss of divine names, but the deprivation of stolen identity, where the very image of the divine was altered to deny the African contribution and centrality in the history of faith. When the image of gods and prophets changes color and origin, the people who created them lose the reflection of their own greatness. The mystery lies not in what was stolen, but in the damage the denial of that image has caused to the social and spiritual fabric. The spiritual conflict is the struggle to reverse the harm of this inferiorization, where the recognition of African beauty and divine authority becomes a political act and one of profound healing. It is the battle to see the divine in one's own skin color. The symbolic journey is one of looking into the mirror of time and recognizing, in the ancient kings of Kush and the goddesses of Meroe, the original face of faith and royalty. It is a reconnection with a lineage that teaches that divinity has an African face, and that this face is the cradle of all organized spirituality. The spiritual unfolding of this recovery of identity is the end of dependence on external narratives. Truth liberates, allowing spirituality to spring directly from the original source, without filters or imposed mediators. Therefore, the stolen identity is being recovered, not as a lost treasure, but as the non-negotiable authority over one's own history and faith. The awakening is complete. The tragedy of forgetting led to the emergence of hidden parallels, where African narratives, even distorted and renamed, appeared in distant corners of the planet, proving the universality of the original knowledge. Consider the resonance between African fertility mythologies and the Greek cults of Demeter, or the similarity between African sacred geometry and temples in Asia. The mystery lies not in what was copied, but in what was deliberately hidden. The spiritual conflict manifests itself in the attempt to deny that humanity's great ideas, foundation, ethics, and resurrection, are, in fact, variations on the same theme that originated in the Nile Valley. It is the struggle to accept that knowledge flowed from Africa. The symbolic journey is that of an archaeologist of the spirit, traveling the world and finding the signature of Osiris in distant rituals, or the power of Isis under the names of other goddesses. It is a journey that destroys the idea of spiritual boundaries and affirms the unity of human experience. The spiritual unfolding of this realization is the dissolution of dogmatic barriers. If all faiths share the same original essence, the struggle between them becomes futile, and respect for the ancestral African source becomes obligatory. Therefore, the hidden parallels are proof that Africa is not just a part of the history of faith, it is the common root from which all the great spiritual trees have been nourished. The most vital and enduring concept that Africa has bequeathed to the world is that of the miracle of resurrection, the promise of life that springs from death. This is the drama of Osiris, whose dismembered and scattered body is the symbol of suffering, but whose reunion is the unwavering affirmation of immortality. It is the lesson that the cycle of life is unbreakable, and that the end is only the seed of a new beginning. The mystery lies not in the miracle itself, but in its origin. This narrative of sacrifice, blood, and resurrection had already comforted millions of Africans millennia before being adopted and retold in other faiths. The spiritual conflict is the appropriation of the concept, where ancestral truth is denied in favor of a more recent narrative, attempting to erase Africa's role as the source of eternal hope. The symbolic journey is the Nile itself, which dies in the drought and is reborn in the flood, bringing new life. The scattered and reunited body of Osiris is a metaphor for African civilization itself, fragmented by history, but always ready to rise again, whole and powerful, with the promise that what is divine cannot be destroyed. The spiritual unfolding of this belief is the acceptance of suffering as a gateway. The spilled blood is not the end, but the price of transformation, a truth that gave strength and resilience to the African people and the diaspora in their darkest moments. Death is merely an initiation to the Lord of eternity. Therefore, the strongest signature of African faith is its promise of return and life. It is knowledge that cannot be rewritten, for it is engraved in the cycle of the sun, in the movement of the stars, and in the heart of those who refuse to give up. The greatest revelation and the central point of the banished knowledge is the truth about the chronology of faith, the realization that Africa is not just a chapter in the history of religion, but the very book where all the great ideas were first written. What history has hidden is the fact that the African continent is ground zero, the true origin of concepts such as the judgment of the soul and the one God. The mystery lies in the persistent academic and religious refusal to accept this chronology. The spiritual conflict is the struggle to reverse the paradigm, forcing the world to recognize that theological depth, the organization of rituals, and moral law first emerged in the Nile Valley, not in Mesopotamia or the Levant. The symbolic journey invites us to readjust our spiritual clock, to honor the true antiquity of faith, understanding that what was considered pagan or primitive was, in fact, the original source from which all doctrines drew. It is a journey that demands humility and a new perspective on history. The spiritual unfolding of this realization is the dissolution of religious hierarchies, as all faiths come to be seen as branches of the same ancestral African tree. The truth is that divine unity was already known and worshipped by black kings and queens millennia ago. Therefore, the chronology of faith is not a line, but a circle that always points back to the south, to the original land that held the first breath of the sacred. The greatest weapon against forgetting was not war, but the song of survival, the way in which African memory, law, and liturgy were codified in rhythms and melodies. Song, lament, and drumming became the living repositories of a history that could not be written in books, but was recorded in voices and bodies. The mystery lies not in the beauty of the music, but in its mystical structure. Each rhythm, each vocal inflection, carries a secret code that invokes the ancestor, calls upon the Orisha, or tells the complete story of a lineage. The spiritual conflict arose from the attempt to reduce this sacred music to mere entertainment, denying its profound theological content and its function as a vehicle for transmitting knowledge. The symbolic journey of song is that of the unbreakable link with Mother Earth. Even on slave ships and in slave quarters, the melody recreated the savanna, the river, and the temple. Song was proof that, even in chains, the spirit remained free and connected to the divine source. The spiritual unfolding of this art is that African faith is a total experience, where word, music, and dance merge to create a direct portal to the sacred. Truth is not read, but lived and felt, and this is the surest way to transmit forbidden knowledge. Therefore, song is Africa's last great document, the library that could not be burned. It continues to resonate, hoping that the new generation will understand that, in the melody, lies the code for total liberation. The veil is lifted, and the sands of time give way. What we discover today is more than history. It is the essence of our soul. The African gods were not defeated. They merely taught us the greatest lesson of spiritual survival, the ability to camouflage ourselves, to flow, and to return. The truth is that the world's faith owes an immeasurable debt to the cradle of creation. The promise of resurrection, the judgment of the soul, the power of the mother goddess, all of this pulsates with the rhythm of the Nile, an unbreakable legacy that echoes in Candomblé, Santeria, and in your own faith. Don't think the book is closed. Africa still holds secrets beneath its pyramids and in its banned texts, mysteries awaiting the courage of the new generation to be revealed. The past is not just memory. It is the prophecy of a future where ancestral identity and truth triumph. Honor this knowledge. Respect this history. If you feel this is just the beginning of the journey, if you want to be a guardian of these ancient secrets, sign up now and turn on notifications. Don't miss the upcoming revelations that lie in the shadow of oblivion.